Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. Before we start, I'd like to thank my latest subscriber on Patreon, Sabrina, for her support, and all my other Patreon supporters. If you would like to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/A Mic on the Podium, and you'll find many ways to subscribe, extra bonus material, and a whole new series of interviews to enjoy, all for the price of a pint of beer once a month. You can also support the podcast by leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. This will help the show reach a bigger audience and will be greatly appreciated. Today, I conduct a conversation with an English conductor who has conducted virtually every orchestra in the United Kingdom and many others further afield. Since 2013, he has been Associate Conductor Halle Pops, a role almost totally unique in the United Kingdom. It's a pleasure to welcome Stephen Bell. Steve, absolutely wonderful to talk to you today.
Thank you, Mike. It's really nice to hear your voice.
And you. It's been quite a few years. I'm trying to remember when it was the last time I saw you. I think I might have come to watch you conduct a James Bond concert with the CBSO. And how are you coping with lockdown and quarantine?
Yeah, all is good. We're all safe, we're all healthy, we're all well, which is the most important thing. For those of your listeners who don't know, I've got 3 primary school age kids, so they're 10, 8 and 6. So I've become a reluctant primary school teacher in the last however many weeks. My wife is a GP, so she's kind of out there at the front line and have to work in her scrubs every day. But no, we're fine. We're doing okay. And good to see things going in the right direction. And hopefully before too long, we can all get back to doing what we do best.
Exactly. Here. With everybody else, I go right back to the beginning, Steve. And I frankly don't know the answers to any of these because I do my homework and I look it up online. And I have no idea when you first started music in your life, whether it was piano or French horn or what. How did music start for you?
That just shows how old I am because the internet doesn't go back that far, doesn't it? I've got no kind of music particularly in the family. My parents didn't play. I don't come from a particularly musical background. My aunt was a pianist and organist of some considerable repute, not professionally, but she taught. And I was sent off for piano lessons before I went to school. So I was probably about 4.5 when I started learning the piano. And certainly while I was still at primary school, I was playing organ for our local church. So I must have had some kind of talent of some sort. My piano teacher, my second piano teacher was an elderly spinster who lived with her sister. They must have both been in their 80s, but as a teenage boy, I was convinced they were like 110. And she was of old school. She would wrap your knuckles with a ruler if you didn't play the right fingering, kind of old school. Yeah. And I was quite happy to sit at a piano and pick out a tune. And I think that's something you can't teach. And that used to get on her pip a little bit because I could just kind of, if somebody played something to me, I could play it back to you. So I obviously had, a kind of decent ear and was able to improvise. She was, she drove an old Morris 1000, a split windscreen, green Morris 1000. And she, I remember very vividly, she drove me to one of my piano exams. I think it was my grade 7 piano exam. She drove me to. She had to sit on 3 or 4 cushions to be able to see over the steering wheel of the Smoggy Minor. And I did rather well. She used to enter students for Trinity rather than associate board exams. Yes. And I got a silver medal for my grade 7 piano, which I always attribute to the fact that the exam was a damn sight easier than the journey there. I've always I've looked back on and had a bit of a laugh about it ever since. And I think that kind of early musical thing will no doubt revisit both of these things a little bit later on during our chat, Mike. But my school teacher, my music teacher at school, a gentleman called Fred Wilde, used to organise visits to the Halle concerts at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. And those of us at school who were interested in going to these things used to pop along to the Thursday night concerts with the Halle. And I also used to listen to the radio. I got in a little bit of trouble from my parents because I spent quite a large proportion of my kind of saved up Christmas and birthday money on a cassette recorder when I was, 13 or something. And used to listen to broadcasts on the radio of Norrie Paramore and the MLO or the BBC, Northern or Light Orchestra, whatever they were called, all those kind of wonderful things. I kind of grew up listening to in effect, Friday night is music night. How bizarre then that I've spent most of my working career thus far with those two institutions very much at the fore, having worked for Radio 2 and the BBC Concert Orchestra for 30 years, and then latterly for the Halle. But Fred Wilde, who was my music master at school, was very, very encouraging. He obviously saw a little bit of something that I was able to do. I remember kind of playing piano in school assemblies and stuff, and he would always put me forward things. And they had a pretty robust kind of peripatetic system in Lancashire back in those days. And Bob Aston, who was one of the horns in the then BBC Northern, and now BBC Phil, came to school and suggested that I perhaps leave the piano aside for a bit and try an orchestral instrument. And I'd never done anything other than the piano until that stage. I was kind of quite a late developer, to be honest, because I must have been 14, I think, before I took up the horn. And it was Bob who kind of got me then into the local youth orchestra scene, the Lancashire Schools Symphony Orchestra. And for anybody who grew up in the Northwest in the 70s and 80s, the name Malcolm Doley will mean something to them. He was the sort of head of music for Lancashire Education Authority, but also conducted the Lancashire Schools Symphony Orchestra and was very much a kind of leading light. Sadly, Malcolm passed away towards the end of last year, I think about October last year. And just before we went into lockdown, a lot of us that had been in the LSSO in the 70s and 80s all met up for a kind of memorial celebration of his life, which was wonderful to kind of pick up from where we'd left off, if you like, some of us almost 40 years ago, quite scarily. But he made it completely sort of normal for us on a Sunday to go and rehearse a Dvorak Symphony or a Elgar Overture or whatever it happened to be. And the insight that he gave us into that kind of musical nuts and bolts, we just didn't know how lucky we were, frankly. I'm not sure how often that happens these days.
It's difficult to say, isn't it? And because of the lack of those music scenes, they've gradually been eroded and chipped away over the last 25, 30 years. So that we're lucky in Birmingham. We still have one that functions, and I was involved with it for 11 or 12 years conducting the school symphony orchestra. But a lot of them, I've gone back to my old county of Kent, and the youth orchestra is not what it was when I left it, 40 years ago.
Which is a terrible shame. We did wonderful things. I mean, we made commercial recordings. We toured, we went to Sweden, we went to Austria, we did a fantastic British Council trip to Argentina. I played Mozart Horn Concerto in the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires, which is something that will, never leave me. Those kind of memories are absolutely extraordinary. And I kind of took those forward. It seemed like a sort of natural progression. Then when I went to the Royal College in the early 1980s, and then continued my sort of musical education from an orchestra point of view in the ECYO. I was there for a couple of years. So I consider myself very fortunate that I was able to kind of see at close hand all of those wonderful institutions and brilliant music making as a young person. And it felt completely normal. It never felt like I was being thrust into anything. I never felt like I was having to be cajoled to do it. It was just what you did at a weekend, and you went along and did these youth orchestra courses, and then as a student, and then into ECYO. I mean, we worked with wonderful conductors. Antal Durati came and did a course, and his musical insights were just extraordinary. And as a young man, you kind of soak all that up and take it all in. So that's kind of my sort of, from an education point of view, before I became a professional musician. But probably because I was kind of late coming to the horn, perhaps that narrowed my options. I know this is one of your 10 questions that you ask about what other profession would you like to attempt.
Yes.
I'd kind of given up on given up's the wrong word, but I'd kind of put to one side all the other kind of educational things. By the time I was in sixth form, I'd made my mind up that this is what I wanted to do.
Sounds familiar.
And almost at the expense of everything else. I mean, I ended up with shocking A-level results because I passed my music, but that was about it. So I was kind of funneled down a career path. Went to the RCM, studied with two great horn teachers, the legendary Dougie Moore, who was the BBC for many years, and then the great Tim Brown, who I absolutely worshipped his playing. And I got to play alongside him while he was in the BBC Symphony Orchestra, which, you know, was one of my early kind of career highlights. And I eventually got a job in the BBC in 1985. Yes, I am that old. And I stayed there for 30 years, and I learned an enormous amount alongside great colleagues in an absolutely vast musical landscape.
We'll come back to the BBC Concert Orchestra in a minute. But you've taken me now until you're in the early 20s, and at no point yet have we really talked about conducting. Well, we haven't at all, in fact. And seeing as you were a horn player who started fairly late, and up until that point was in the piano, I'm assuming conducting didn't really impact or be something you did until your late teens. Would I be right?
You are probably right. I did a little bit with a youth orchestra. I think one of the first times I ever conducted in public was Leonard Salcedo's percussion concerto in Preston Guildhall, a venue that we always used to reckon had great acoustics for snooker. And we did a tour to Sweden where I put together a group of players and we played through a couple of the Brandenburg concertos. So there were early signs that you know, I was interested in putting those kind of things together and taking the initiative and doing all of that, which continued at the RCN. And although I went principally as a horn player with second study piano, I then started to do more and more things with the Student Association Orchestra. And by the time I joined the postgrad conducting scholars course, and the three kind of luminaries there at the time were Christopher Adey, John Forster, and Norman Del Mar. And Norman, as a former horn player himself, I think kind of took me under his wing a little bit. And we used to have great times. His Sunday morning classes up at his house in Barnet, along with the other kind of contemporaries in that class, which were Graham Jenkins and Grant Llewellyn and myself. We were the kind of main three. And we used to go up there on a Sunday morning, and he'd sit in his music room with two grand pianos belly to belly, and he'd pull off a score of whatever, and you'd play the left hand of this and the right hand of that, and you'd conduct and you'd read the clefs with the, you know, it was a wonderful insight into the kind of nuts and bolts kind of thing. And Norman was terrific. I mean, he was a great enthusiast. I learned a huge amount from him.
Very similar to how it was with Jonathan, his son, because I learned with Jonathan at the Birmingham Conservatoire for a year, and he would do the same. He would get us to, if you weren't conducting, he'd get us to sit at the piano. And as a fiddle player, I only ever got horns and cor anglais because I had to learn to transpose, or clarinets and trumpets. You know, I never got flutes and violins ever.
It's a steep learning curve, but hey, it's invaluable. It's absolutely invaluable, because it makes you kind of realise how all that nuts and bolts stuff does go together, and it's stood me in great stead ever since, actually.
Two great names as well from that period. I mean, there's a little bit of difference in our ages, but similar sort of growing up through the time when, you know, youth orchestras and music making was great in the UK. Chris Adey, you know, conductor who conducted lots of youth orchestras. In fact, I last saw him, it would be 2 years ago this coming summer. What an amazing sort of, he was an ex-player as well, an ex-fiddle player, and John Forster.
He was ex-fiddle player. I think he was. I think he was in the Philharmonium, wasn't he?
Either that or the LPO. I can't remember. But when I saw him 2 years ago, I was somewhere shadowing actually what he was doing, and the stories that he told me about, you know, playing and who he played for and all of that. But I remember him, you know, when he came to Kent and conducted us, he was somebody we really looked forward to when he came, because, you know, he just. Great insights about what it was like.
The word you've touched on there is insight, and I think that's absolutely invaluable. You've been an orchestral player for a number of years, and you've seen kind of what a player needs from a conductor, and what you think a conductor needs to give to a player, and I think that's absolutely invaluable. And I've always approached what I do from that side of the tracks, if you like, that I like to think that I know what is required from the orchestra musicians in order to get the best results.
The other name you mentioned, John Forster, he worked in Kent, where I was as a kid, and he conducted the Kent County Youth String Orchestra. But what Chris Adey and John Forster were perfect at just dealing with teenagers and enthusing them, and not talking down to them or over them, or they just seemed to get on with them, and they would make the week or tour or whatever it was an enjoyable thing. You know, they were both brilliant at that.
That's absolutely key to it, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
you can't kind of browbeat somebody into doing something. So yeah, to be encouraging and to be positive, and even if there's a criticism, precede it with a compliment in order to get something across, which is also something. And I think there is a connection that Todd Handley used to do absolutely brilliantly. I was very fortunate that Todd spent a little bit of time with me after I left full-time education and was a player. Todd was absolutely brilliant at sort of explaining some of those things that nobody ever kind of explained to you, how to detach yourself from what is going on around you, which was an absolutely invaluable lesson. And he was another one who absolutely knew how to draw the best out of his playing.
So we get a job at the BBC Concert Orchestra, and I know, because I'm an ex-professional too, it's tough. That's many hours a week, especially in the concert orchestra. That you've got Friday nights, music nights most weeks. You've got all sorts of different recording things going on. How does conducting run alongside your horn playing career at this time? Were you always conducting alongside, or did it sort of flit in and out?
To be honest, it did take a little bit of a back seat because, as you say, a full-time orchestra job for a BBC orchestra is pretty much all-consuming. And by the time I'd sat on the principal horn seat, you kind of need to keep match fit, and there's a certain element of there isn't time to go off and do various other bits and pieces. And actually, it was some time before I got back into it. I have the National Youth Orchestra of Canada to thank for that, because in the 1990s, I got a call to say, would I mind going out to do some coaching for the NYOC, which education is something I've always been interested in. I've always taught. I've always, at any opportunity, managed to find time to sort of adjudicate competitions for young musicians, or to spend some time with youth ensembles, because I think it's vital. It's absolutely important that kind of lifeblood sort of keeps going, and we keep regenerating it, and we keep trying to enthuse young musicians and give them the encouragement. So that's something I've always been interested in. So I got a call to go to Canada. Would I mind popping over to Toronto for 3 weeks just to coach the horns of the National Youth Orchestra of Canada, which was a joy. It was brilliant, and the first time I'd ever done that kind of thing at a sort of national level, if you like. I jumped at the opportunity. And as I was there, the guy who was the assistant conductor had announced that he wasn't coming back the following year, and there was an opportunity, and I kind of put myself forward. I said, look, I'm really happy, whatever I can do to help, if you want to come and do some of that, I'm really, really happy to do that. So I did, and I stayed for almost 10 years. And that kind of rekindled my enthusiasm for taking apart great pieces of music bit by bit and then bolting them back together again. And over the course of a longish summer course, before they headed off on their annual sort of summer tour, there was the opportunity to work with these great musicians. And although their age range was slightly larger than perhaps youth orchestras would be here, they were 14 to 28. So ended up with some kind of young professionals in the mix. But actually that worked really well, because that kind of encouraged some of the younger guys to raise their game, and they could see what they could aspire to. And I really fond memories of working over there in Canada, and I did it for almost 10 years. And then I'd started to pick up work back here in the UK, and I kind of had to let it go, because the summer period when I first started off, seasonal work of summer concerts and Christmas concerts, that was when I kind of started to make my mark here, as it were. So I kind of reluctantly bade farewell to the NYOC, but really wonderful times with them, working on big repertoire. They did Mahler symphonies and the Right Spring and Walter 1 and Shostakovich 10, and huge pieces, and to have the opportunity to really get your teeth into something like that with keen young players who wanted to learn and wanted to know. And it really kind of refired my interest in what I'd been studying as a postgrad with Norman, and set me back on the road to going, you know what, this is me.
Yeah. As an aside, I have been asked, why do I work with the CBSO Youth Orchestra, and why did I work? Because I don't with Birmingham School Symphony Orchestra, and part of that is that you do get to learn your repertoire so in depth because you're working with the kids for a week at a time, and you get to learn it bar by bar, note by note. Plus, there's this energy in the room from these people who are voracious to learn as much as possible. And often with the CBSO Youth Orchestra, I do the first 5 or 6 days rehearsal and then hand it over to somebody else. And people say to me, "You're nuts! What'd you do that for?" Well, it's a perfect chance to learn Mahler 7 or Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances or whatever it is. That I can learn it on the
absolutely, and how rewarding to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And to be able, and you and I both know this as a player, to kind of pass on that sort of inside knowledge,
yes,
of how all that kind of works and how best to serve their hunger for that knowledge. Absolutely.
Now we've come to a point where our lives are very similar. You've now rekindled an interest in conducting. I would have been about 32 or so when that started for me, and I started conducting amateur orchestras. I'm guessing we're around the same age now. You're about the same age when you've started working with the National Youth Orchestra of Canada. How was your juggling work conducting and your day job with the BBC? I know with the CBSO they were incredibly helpful and nice about it. What was it like, going in and asking, can I have this weekend off because I've got to conduct a concert? I'd like to conduct a concert.
They were absolutely fine about it. I mean, we have, like you said, we have a kind of similar background. The difference is now that the job that you have as associate conductor of the CBSO was with the orchestra you were with for 28 years, whereas the job I went to nearly 8 years ago was with a different orchestra. And actually, in a way, I think that kind of helped, because when I was leaving my duties at the BBC to go and conduct, it was doing something that I wasn't being paid by the BBC to do.
Yes.
And although I go back to the BBC and conduct several of their orchestras on a regular basis, which is always lovely, actually I had a lot of support from my colleagues in the BBC, and I did do the occasional project with them too. But that's, as you will know, it's a slightly strange beast to stand up in front of your colleagues. I mean, it's actually quite hard to do. It's akin to sort of standing up in front of your class as a primary school kid and reciting a poem or singing a song or whatever. If you can do it in front of your peers, you can do it anywhere. I kind of felt it was better for me to go off and do that kind of work elsewhere. And because of that, the BBC were very flexible about allowing me to be off. And I think because I was in a position of a principal chair with a co-principal who was very happy to step up when I wasn't there, that kind of helped enormously. And they were really, really supportive. In the end, when I started my work with the Halle, which started back in 2012, it got to the point where it quickly became clear to me that I had to make a decision as to whether I was going to throw myself at that full time.
Well, that's the interesting thing now, is that my next question was going to be, what were the thought processes, other than obviously one side of your work, your conducting work now getting busier and busier and busier. I always envisaged that one day the conducting would rise, which means the playing would lower, and eventually I'd step off the parapet of playing and jump onto the conducting as it was rising up. But it never quite happened like that. And there came a day when I had to make a decision. How did you come to that decision that day?
I did make that decision, and it was quite hard. But actually, you've been very kind. I am a few years older than you. Once I got to the point where I could see the 30-year mark coming up in one section, in one orchestra, I kind of thought, you know what? And I'm so driven by the creative process of what I now do, that it was a bit of a no-brainer, really. I love the blank sheet of paper. I love what are we going to do? Here's a complete blank canvas. We need to put something together. And the end product of that is overhearing an audience member on the way out of the hall going, "Oh, I really enjoyed that concert." I now get to do that not only on a one-off basis, but part of my job at the Halle is partly a planning role. Because unlike your job at the CBSO as associate conductor, my kind of role at the Halle is more specifically geared to the sort of pops side of what the orchestra does.
That's right.
So
yeah.
I have a partly admin role with a member of the planning team who works solely on the pops to put those kind of concerts together, and that's the part of the job I enjoy the most, if I'm really honest. I mean, it's very nice to go out and do all these concerts and go out on the road and bring joy to thousands in an audience and all of that, but it's the putting the projects together that really gets my kind of artistic juices flowing. That's the bit that I really, really relish. And, you know, how do we make it relevant? How do we make it interesting for the players as much as the audiences, because they don't want to churn out the same concerts every year? How do we make it that it's financially viable, that it attracts enough of an audience? We need a broad kind of spread to get as wide an audience demographic into our concerts as we can and spread the word of what we do. So it's all of those things together that kind of get my artistic juices going. That's the bit of the job that I really relish and I really enjoy.
So the Halle actually calls it the Halle Pops, which, you know, Birmingham doesn't have I mean, it has their Friday night series, which I do a few things here and there. Liverpool have a similar sort of thing. I don't know which night of the week, but nobody actually calls it a Pops thing. So I'm interested to know, as the associate conductor in charge of the Halle Pops, how many concerts a year do you have to program? Do you conduct them all, or do you farm some of them out to visiting conductors? You know, what's entailed with putting together a season of Halle Pops?
This is something that was John Summers' idea, our outgoing chief executive. He's announced that he's finishing this summer. And it's something that he and I chatted about, well, it's got to be 8-9 years ago. And basically, he wanted my help in putting their kind of Pops series together. You could have absolutely knocked me over with a feather when he came to my dressing room. I remember it absolutely as though it were yesterday. We were in the stage in Gateshead with the Halle. And his question to me was, so what do we call your position then? Because I'd absolutely no idea that he was going to make it anything like as official as it has become. And actually, it's quite kind of typically forward-looking of John. He has a great insight into the profession as a whole. And I think he thought that perhaps the money-making side of what the Halle does needed a hand on the tiller, as it were. And I think I'm right in saying we're the only, certainly UK orchestra, that has a kind of dedicated conductor that is linked to their Pops programs. And that in itself was particularly exciting for me, having, you know, I said to you right at the beginning of this chat, grown up listening to the BBC Light Orchestras on the radio and listening to Friday Night Music Night, and Sydney Torch and Norrie Paramore and all these wonderful luminaries, to actually then be able to go, actually, I'm happy to curate a contribution to this style of music and this kind of music, which is, you know, it has such a huge following, was a no-brainer. It was absolutely, bit his hand off. Of course, I'd be delighted in whatever you end up deciding to call this position. I had no idea that they were going to kind of make it an official position within the orchestra. We do somewhere in the region of 30 plus concerts per year, including our summer Pops and our Christmas concerts, which kind of fall under the jurisdiction of the Pops, of which I maybe do 2/3 or so. Right. So there's a number that kind of get passed out to particularly if it's a specific project, get passed out to guest conductors. We also, there's a number of those shows within a year that get handed over to the Halle's assistant conductor. This is a program that the Halle have been hugely successful with, right back to, I think Ed Gardner was the very first, but there's been some wonderful conductors have come through the ranks. Even recently, the likes of Jamie Phillips, who you know very well.
Yes. I think I've got 2 ex-Halle assistants so far to come on the podcast. Ed and Jonathan Hayward. He's been on as well.
Jonathan Hayward, who just finished. And it's a superb experience. I mean, that's another John Summers initiative. After Mark had joined the Halle as music director 20 years ago. In fact, it's just 20 years this week since he accepted the job, and it has been really kind of life-changing for so many of those young conductors coming through. So the assistant conductors get a look in on some of those kind of shows, the ones that perhaps are more family orientated some of our Christmas concerts.
Yeah.
Otherwise, by January the band would be completely sick of the sight of me. And it's really nice to be able to kind of encourage and go through those programs and pass them on to people. If there are specific projects that come in that need an external conductor, then we're really happy to look at all of those. So it's a big job in terms of admin. There's a lot of sourcing of material, of liaising with our kind of library team to see what is available and what is out there. It's not as straightforward as as putting on a overture concerto symphony program. There's a huge amount in kind of making sure you got the right soloist and stuff's in the right key and all of that. So there's quite a lot of admin that comes with it, but I'm really happy to do that. And that's in turn actually taught me a huge amount about the business and how it all works and how it all runs, and how we create a successful and financially viable pops series that we can get out to as broad an audience as possible. That's the chief idea.
The next two topics are sort of linked with what you've been doing with the Halle and, well, throughout your career actually, but mainly to do with that, in the fact that you do have a rather large and varied repertoire, because I remember playing for you on many occasions in Birmingham before I retired, and you've conducted anything and everything. So first of all, to ask you, do you have any repertoire limits? But then secondly, because of the amount of repertoire that you get through in a year, and the variety of repertoire, do you have a way of learning your scores that you stick to? Do you have a system for marking up? Do you mark in things, colours, etc.? How do you do it all?
Okay, I had a really interesting conversation with Mark Elder not very long ago, who said to me, "Oh, I'm restricting myself to 6 new pieces a year. What about you, Steve?" And I just out of interest, although obviously mine are in miniature and much more lowbrow, for want of a better word, because I obviously do a lot of stuff that's kind of pops or film related or whatever. But I did do a little tot up for 1 year, just to kind of have a bit of a get back at Mark, because he said, "Oh, I'm learning 6 new pieces a year." I got to over 400 and then I stopped counting.
Well, that's why I asked you the question, because I knew it would be something along those lines. I mean, I don't do as much pops as you, but I do a fair amount of film music concerts, and yeah, I mean, the numbers that you get to in a year are staggering, and you've just got to find a way of learning them quickly and efficiently. And yeah,
there is a method that I've often used, and I have to thank Todd Hanley again for this, because it was one of the questions that I asked him when he was very kindly kind of holding my hand through some of my early concerts. And his thought was that you should read a score through 3 times.
Right.
You speed read it to get the overall kind of bigger picture.
Yeah.
And then you go back and you read it again with the changes particularly in mind. So any particular changes of section or tempo changes, and then go back over it a 3rd time and look at it in much greater detail. I try not to listen to recordings of stuff, although I have to confess, if it's short notice and you need to learn something really quickly, then it is kind of helpful. Sometimes if it's a brand new arrangement of something, I often use Paul Campbell at Studio Orchestrations, who's an absolutely brilliant arranger, very, very super talented guy, and he often does stuff for us that we need either transcribing or brand new versions of something. And he'll sometimes quite helpfully include a sort of MP3 file of the sort of outline, even if it's computer generated, just to kind of get an idea, which if you're up against it time-wise, sometimes is quite useful.
I totally agree. Alistair Malloy does that with his arrangements of things. If you're up against it time-wise, he'll send you a Dropbox folder with computer mock-ups of things that he's arranged. And yeah, and when you are time limited, they can be so useful.
And especially if they're if they're medleys of stuff, and you need to another and make it sound as natural as possible, and you're kind of taking things almost out of context for concerts such as that. It can be really useful. I sometimes sit at a piano and work out stuff. One of Todd's comments always was that you should be able to look at the page and know in your head what it sounds like. That was something that he was particularly good at. And I think, going back to one of the things I touched on earlier, because I can kind of hear something and then replicate it at the piano quite readily, I think that's sort of half of that skill. And you and I both know that if you kind of look at something and something's not right, it should kind of jump off the page in red at you. Yes, I do mark up. That's partly because as I'm getting older, my eyesight's not so great. And sometimes publishers do put time signatures and changes in tempo in such a small font that I often will kind of enlarge that in order to just be absolutely sure. I'm not a big fan of doing things from memory, and that's not because I get through an enormous amount of repertoire in a year. You know, having sat in the BBC Concert Orchestra for 30 years, I no idea how many times I would have played the signature tune to Friday Night is Beauty Night, but I still wouldn't be happy just doing it without the dots there.
Yes.
I'm not particularly comfortable, certainly, about anything that involves a soloist without the score, because I kind of feel that you need to let them be as free as possible, and it's your responsibility to be shepherd a little bit. I occasionally do things from memory, but I admire those guys who can do it. You know, even going back to National Youth Orchestra Canada days, you know, if you'd spent a whole summer doing Mahler 6, yes, I probably could have done Mahler 6 from memory, but I think I would rather have had the comfort blanket of the score there, even if you don't look at it in great detail. It's really interesting. One of the things the BBC used to do was they used to produce something called control scores. And the control scores used to go to the guy in the box who was mixing. Yeah. And actually, they ended up condensing a 100-page score into 4 pages of A4. And they just had the lead line on them. Yeah. And actually, for rehearsals, to use the full score and then to use the control score for concerts, I used to find it actually quite useful, because by that stage, you knew the stuff and you knew what was going on. I'm going to correct myself. You know before the first rehearsal what's going on, and to actually use that control score without having to flick hundreds of pages over all the time was sometimes really, really useful. Just as a roadmap. It's you know the stuff. The preparation for me is absolutely key and vital and king. There is no shortcut around that. You've got to do the prep before you even stand up at the first rehearsal in front of an orchestra, because if you haven't done it, as you know as well as I do, they'll see through it in the first 2 bars. Exactly.
And that's another interesting point that I remember talking to my wife about stopping playing, and when you've been, I did both jobs. I was assistant conductor or associate conductor and sub-principal second violin for 9 years. And so I was constantly working. When that violin playing stopped, I think she thought that I might suddenly have a lot more free time. When you don't, you just end up actually studying during the day rather than up until 3 a.m. studying, which is the only time I could do it before.
You fill that time other ways. Yeah, I say your situation is slightly different, because I guess with the CBSO, part of your deal was to kind of understudy what the chief conductor or
occasionally, but most of the time I was playing, so there were of course the famous occasions when I jumped in at 90 minutes notice, but I didn't sit and, like a normal assistant conductor, I didn't sit in the rehearsals because I was actually playing in them, so it was slightly different.
Yeah. But obviously what I did, I've done in an orchestra that I wasn't a member of. I played with them on a few occasions 30 years ago or so, but never been a member. But how interesting that having listened to the BBC Concert Orchestra on the radio as a young lad, and my first experience of live orchestra music was with the Halle back in the mid-70s. It was just after Jimmy Loughren had taken over, so I never saw Barbaroli in action with the Halle, but I reckon sort of mid-70s as a schoolboy going to hear them live, and they're the 2 orchestras that I've ended up spending most of my working life with.
I don't want to preface one of the 10 questions. What I'm sort of doing is giving you a chance to just let me know, over your 30 years as a player, you would have seen literally tens of thousands, I'm guessing, or at least thousands of conductors conduct you. Any of those names that you remember vividly and thinking at the time, oh my God, that's brilliant. When I conduct, I might use that or steal that, or rather than waiting till the 10 questions when you can give a shorter answer. But I just wondered, over that time, who stood out for you?
That's a really tough one, because in an orchestra such as the BBC Concert Orchestra, there's such a wide variety of repertoire.
Yeah.
That so often it would be dependent on the repertoire who the conductor was. All I will say is that in that sort of privileged position, sat at the back of the orchestra, what an absolutely invaluable grounding that was in learning what to do and what not to do. I don't mean that unkindly.
No, but that's come up time and time again. And I would say, and I do say to young conductors, go to as many rehearsals as you can, and not just the music director. Go to the Friday night lighter stuff. Go to the Sunday kids stuff, because sometimes you'll see a lot of what not to do, and you'll learn more from that than you will from the good ones.
I couldn't agree more. Seeing what to do and what not to do, when to leave alone, actually, and that's something that we collectively as conductors, perhaps it's the hardest lesson to learn, because when you're learning the stuff on your own, you want to do as much as you can to be as helpful as possible, but actually just leaving people to do their own thing and shepherd what's going on around is often far more useful. And perhaps we're not the best at just letting go of that control and letting people do it. That's the hard thing about standing. That's the hard thing about standing in front of 80 very intelligent musical minds, isn't it? That you have to know when less is more.
Trust is the word. And this is it's literally popped into my head. Trust. And the reason why you keep repeating that word is the first time I saw you conduct, I was playing, and it was a freelance gig at Chatsworth House, and I didn't know you, and I was sitting in the first violins, which for me was bad enough because I was the second violinist, so I was suddenly having to learn all these bloody notes, on the E string. I bet I didn't play on the E string, but I remember sitting in that rehearsal thinking, oh, this guy's good, and he's just trusting us to do it. And I thought, oh, this is great, because you turn up on a lot of those sort of what we like to affectionately call muddy field dates, and sometimes the rehearsals can be just awful. But I remember thinking, oh, this is a breeze. It's giving me time to learn some of these high notes, and he's just trusting the orchestra. And I think we both. Maybe it's because of our backgrounds playing in orchestras that we do both trust the orchestra. And it's learning when to trust them. That's the important thing.
I think it is. And the other thing that I would kind of add to that, which I think is completely crucial, is the fact that the trust is two ways.
Yes, absolutely.
It's all very well for a conductor to trust the players to do what they do to the best of their ability. And, let's be honest, British musicians are amongst the best in the world. And even on those kind of concerts where there's precious little rehearsal time, I know that I can trust those guys to go, yeah, we'll turn it out. But it also comes in reverse, that they have to trust the guy on the box to give them what they need and what they want.
Yes.
I couldn't agree with you more. Having sat in an orchestra for 30 years, I without blowing my own trumpet, I like to think that I know what is required of me in those kind of instances. When there's not a load of rehearsal to kind of fine tune and do whatever. It's down to the instinct of, yes, you know what I'm doing, I know what you're doing, and we'll all be fine. It's eye contact. It's that kind of communication without actually having to say anything. The instinct, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It's the trust of the players to go, yeah, we can do this.
Steve, it is 10 questions time, every conductor's favourite bit of the podcast. So I will start with the usual first two questions. What? Oh, I didn't even drag them up, you fool. And it's much like you talking about memory, I still can't remember what the 10 questions are. And this is episode 34 or 5 or something. So.
Oh, goodness me.
Yeah. So I'll start with the first two. What sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
I had to think about this for quite a long time. You very kindly sent the 10 questions slightly in advance, and I did get a chance to read them. Whether it's because of going on holiday, I do love the sound of the waves lapping up against the seashore. It's just something. I've never lived by the sea. I've always lived kind of, landlocked. But there's something about that kind of makes you want to relax. It may be something to do with the fact that you associate it with being on downtime and holidays with the family. I don't know. What noise do I hate? I've got a bit of a dentist phobia, if I'm honest. As a former brass player, I had some horrendous root canal work done on one of my front teeth, which to this day is still not resolved. So my noise that I hate would have to be the dentist drill, I'm afraid, because it offends all the senses. Not only can you see it coming at you, you can hear it, but you can feel it and you can taste it and you can smell it. so I'm afraid that's the one that I'm going to go for. My pet hate is the dentist drill. And apologies to the lovely Mark, who is my dentist.
If you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
My main holiday, our family holiday for the last 6 years, has been going to the French Alps to ski. We do try to get a week away in the summer in this country and sit by the beach and let the kids run on the sand and whatever. But there's something, I'm not a particularly good skier. My youngest child is 6, and she's actually now a better skier than I am. So that gives you a bit of an idea of my skiing prowess. But what I love about it is partly the weather. You're up at altitude, hopefully in the sun, surrounded by glorious scenery, good food, good wine, good company. And actually, you're not able to think about anything else while you're doing it. It takes you completely away from the daily grind. And for that reason, it's a great getaway. So there you go, 24 hours up the Alps and a chalet supper and far too much to eat and drink, please.
Who would be a favourite conductor of yesteryear?
Oh, I can add more than one. Well,
Yes,
I
you can,
put
yes.
Kleiber, I'd put Kleiber down. I just love watching old videos of Carlos Kleiber, who had such a way of communicating with orchestras. His kind of, what's the best way of putting this? With a minimum amount of effort, he could get the maximum amount of effect. He just had a wonderful way of being sort of rather balletic and humorous, and it's just the power of communication, which we were talking about earlier. If I could have more than one, I would love to include the late, great Todd Hanley. I had an enormous amount of respect for Todd. I worked with him a lot, and he was very, very kind to me as I was a young conductor who thought he knew far more than he did. Todd had got a wonderful way of making players want to give of their best. That's a really awkward way of putting it. Whenever I played for Todd, I always wanted it to be good for him, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And he just had a way of encouraging and making people want to sit up and give of their best. You can't bottle it, you can't quantify it, but actually he was absolutely brilliant at that, and his rehearsal technique and his way of getting the results that he wanted. He was always loyal to the music. It wasn't about him. It was about what was on the page and recreating what the composer wanted. And I just respected that hugely. He was just brilliant.
I played for him towards the end of his life. I didn't think I ever would, and then he came and did a couple of things with the CBSO, and I thoroughly enjoyed playing for him. And he was obviously coming towards the end of his life. He could barely walk, but yeah, his manner and the way he rehearsed, and there was always a ready quip and a good sense of humour. I really enjoyed it.
The quips are great.
Yeah, it made me wish I'd played for him a lot earlier on in my life.
The quips were great. I remember because he was principal guest of the BBC Concert Orchestra for a while, which is when we got to know each other particularly well. And at the time, I was doing quite a bit of work as a player with the LSO.
Yeah.
And we did the Gramophone Awards live at the Barbican, and he was one of the conductors that was kind of wheeled out to do his party piece.
Right.
And there were some great names. Shai was there, and the late, bless him, Richard Hickox was there, and all these fantastic names being wheeled out onto the podium to do their party piece. And Todd came out to do Tintagel.
Oh wow!
And he stood up in front of the LSO for what had been the first time in a long number of years. And his opening self-deprecating line was, "I bet some of you thought I was dead." It was just brilliant because it broke the ice and everybody kind of breathed a sigh of relief and went, "Oh my God, yeah, great. We're just going to get to play." And they played their pants off for him. It was just fabulous. He always had a knack of making people feel at ease, and always got a way of making people want to play their best for him. And I just respect that so much.
Brilliant. Who would be a favourite current conductor?
Oh, you see, I've cheated a little bit here, because he is a current conductor, because he's still with us, but actually he announced his retirement not that long ago, and that would be the great Bernard Haitink. Bernard was one of those, I had the privilege of being conducted by him on a number of occasions, and again, he wasn't showy, it wasn't about him, it was all about the music. But what always particularly impressed me about him was the way he was able to get a sound from an orchestra. And you know, that's the holy grail for us, isn't it? That's the thing.
Yeah.
How do you, by relatively modest and minimal body movements, because he wasn't a showy conductor by any stretch of the imagination, but the way he was able to manipulate all those players to get a particular sound was quite magical. So he has to be one of my all-time current favourites.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
I must confess, I did think long and hard about this, and I've come up with one that's pretty left field in the end.
Good, I like left field.
No, that's fine. I don't know whether the name Vladimir Tornopolsky would slip off your tongue.
No.
Perhaps that easily. He's a Russian composer who I think is still alive. I would imagine he's probably a wee bit older than me, so maybe mid-60s. But a number of years ago, probably heading for 20 years ago, certainly 16, 17 years ago, he wrote a version of Cinderella, but based on the Roald Dahl version of Cinderella, which is a little bit more macabre than the kids' fairy tale that we perhaps know best. So it's I think he describes it as is it a cantata? I'm not sure how he kind of describes that. It's a huge piece of music, which we programmed with the Halle to coincide with Roald Dahl centenary. It's got huge forces, including an orchestra, a chamber ensemble, a group of younger players, a sort of youth orchestra to go alongside the main parts, a children's choir, and actors who take the part of the main characters, including the Ugly Sisters and you know the story of Cinderella.
Yes.
But it was a hugely complex piece, and we did it staged at the Bridgewater Hall with the Halle and the Halle Children's Choir, who learnt the whole thing from memory. So there's the added kind of stress of shepherding a 80, 90 piece choir who have all got this thing absolutely off the page. Young actors, we often collaborate with the Manchester Metropolitan University, who do a wonderful performing arts course. So we had half a dozen students taking the part of the Ugly Sisters and the narrator and Cinderella and the Prince. But the combination of all that and what is actually quite a complex score, I attribute to some of my grey hairs, frankly. But it was great fun, but actually really hard to pull off on a live show.
When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
I would have to go with, and this is because I'm very, very fortunate. I live in the middle of nowhere. We live at the end of a lane with no passing traffic. So the constant noise of traffic, and when you travel anywhere, that has to be my kind of biggest bugbear, really. So it would either be earplugs or noise-cancelling headphones, so that I can kind of shut myself off from the rest of the hubbub.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
I don't know whether this applies to being a conductor or this is just being an adult. Can you be both simultaneously? Who knows? I'm not sure. It's the paperwork. I don't mean scores. I mean the rest of it all.
Yeah.
The sending out the invoices and following up on all of that kind of gubbins. I'm not a big fan of the office paperwork. I would have to leave that behind in my room 101, I'm afraid.
I agree. Endless emails. Can you look at this program that's coming from somewhere and there's 11 pieces on it, and can you do all of that? Can you look, and then you send it back, and then 5 minutes later, that whilst you're then doing another bit of work, they send. So you're constantly juggling things that seemingly there's nothing or very little to do with what you should be doing. It is long, tiresome stuff.
It is long, tiresome stuff. I'm thinking more about the sort of quarterly VAT returns and petrol receipts and all of that
Yeah.
kind of really, really, really mind-numbing stuff. If it's to do with the program, I'm kind of not bothered really, because the end result is something that hopefully I shall be proud of and want to be involved in. But yeah, it's all the mundane stuff that goes with paperwork and invoices and all that kind of gubbins.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Well, as I mentioned earlier in this interview, by the time I decided I was going to be a professional musician, I'd kind of gone at it at the expense of absolutely everything else. I've always been a big follower of motorsport. I'm an avid watcher of Formula One races. I'm not necessarily putting myself up here for being an F1 driver, but maybe something related to motorsport is perhaps something I might have an interest in.
It's funny, I was sitting the other day having my breakfast, flicking around the TV channels, and was watching some old game of cricket on Sky, because of course there's no cricket on at the moment. And I thought to myself, well, if I don't get back to conduct, maybe I could, go and train to be an umpire. Something I could go and do later in life. And it's amazing how sports and conductors that seem to be quite a big correlation. You're not the first person to talk about F1. I'm not the first person to talk about cricket. It's funny, isn't it, that we have this sort of love of sports.
Is it the thrill of the live event? Is it the
maybe
competitive element, or is it the the fear? I don't know what it is. It caused me to think a lot. I have to say, that question. That I'm not sure what else I would or indeed could do. My wife, we met when she was a freelance musician. She's now a doctor, so she has actually done the whole "what profession other than your own would you like to attempt?" and she's actually done it, and that's something I'm hugely proud of her for having kind of thrown a six and started again. If you see what I mean.
If the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
I've just mentioned Charlie, my wife. She makes a mean curry. In fact, we had a curry night only last night, and absolutely terrific it was too. So I think my final choice of meal would be one of her homemade curries. What would the drink be? I'm heading back to my stereotype as a former brass player here, because I do like a beer.
Yeah.
So it would be an IPA or a traditional English bitter and a curry. There you go. I'm brass player through and through, really. Then, aren't I?
Well, I have to say, as a string player, I wouldn't mind if somebody put down a curry and a nice pint of bitter in front of me either. So
there you go.
Yeah, you're not
simple
alone.
Pleasures, Mike. Simple pleasures. That's what it's all about, isn't it?
And it's been a simple pleasure to talk to you, Steve. It really has. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope to see you very, very, very soon.
Thank you very much. I had a quick flick through the website. I've listened to a few of your podcasts, but having seen the list of people that you have on your podcasts now, I'm really touched and thrilled to be part of such illustrious company. So, Mike, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and you stay safe. And thank you very, very much.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I talk to a young American conductor who is making quite a name for himself both in the US and Europe. Not only has he been associate conductor of the Minnesota Orchestra, he's also found time to set up his own scholarship initiative. Until then, bye-bye.